They called him Tank and thought it was a joke, just some old guy who probably drove a truck in Vietnam. What the young veterans at the VFW Fish Fry didn't know was that Tank Thompson had earned that nickname by destroying 12 enemy tanks in 3 years of combat, and his real story would silence their laughter forever. Every Friday night at 6 p.m. sharp, the Millfield VFW Post 1847 transformed from a quiet meeting hall into the social center of the local veteran community. The weekly fish fry was more than just a meal. It was a tradition that brought together men and women who had served their country across 6 different decades, from Korea to Afghanistan. The smell of frying catfish mixed with cigarette smoke and the low murmur of conversations about everything from VA benefits to grandchildren's baseball games. Folding tables covered with red checkered tablecloths filled the main hall, and a small bar in the corner served beer in plastic cups alongside stories that got better with each telling. In the far corner, at the same small table he'd occupied for the past 8 years, sat a man most people knew only as Tank. 74 years old, with silver hair, kept military short, and hands that showed the wear of 7 decades, he cut a quiet figure among the more boisterous groups of younger veterans. He always ordered the same thing: 2 pieces of catfish, coleslaw, and a cup of black coffee. He always sat alone, though not unfriendly. He'd nod politely when people passed, sometimes exchange a few words about the weather or the local baseball team. To most of the VFW members, Tank Thompson was simply part of the furniture. He'd been coming to the fish fry longer than anyone could remember, paid his dues on time, never caused trouble, and never volunteered for much beyond helping stack chairs after events. The kind of steady, unremarkable member that every VFW post had, an old-timer who probably drove supply trucks or worked in communications during Vietnam and now lived quietly on his pension. That perception was about to change. The evening's dynamics shifted when 3 of the post's newer members walked in together. Jake Morrison, 29, had done 2 tours in Iraq as an infantry sergeant. Marcus Johnson, 31, was a former Marine who'd served 3 deployments in Afghanistan. Tony Ricci, 28, had been a cavalry scout in Iraq and was now working as a defense contractor. All 3 had joined the VFW in the past year, drawn by camaraderie and the discount drinks, but they carried themselves with the subtle arrogance of men who believe their wars have been more real, more dangerous, and more technologically advanced than anything the previous generation had experienced. They grabbed their usual table near the bar, close enough to the TV to watch the game, but far enough from the older members to have their own conversations. Tonight, those conversations centered around a topic they'd been debating for weeks: whether the Vietnam-era veterans really understood modern warfare. "I'm not trying to be disrespectful," Jake said, cutting into his fish with more force than necessary, "but there's just no comparison between what we dealt with and what they went through. IEDs, urban warfare, real-time intelligence, night vision, GPS coordination. We fought a completely different kind of war." Marcus nodded, sipping his beer. "Exactly. These guys fought in the jungle with outdated equipment against an enemy that barely had air support. We were dealing with asymmetric warfare, advanced explosives, multi-theater operations. It's not even the same military." Tony gestured toward the corner where Tank sat quietly eating his dinner. "I mean, look at guys like Tank over there. Sweet old dude, don't get me wrong, but he probably spent the war fixing trucks or unloading supplies. Maybe saw some action, maybe didn't. But listening to him try to relate to what we went through, it's like comparing Little League to the World Series." Their conversation wasn't particularly quiet, and it wasn't meant to be. There was an edge of performance to it, the kind of talk meant to establish hierarchy and make sure everyone understood who the real warriors were. Tank heard every word. He'd been hearing variations of this conversation for months, ever since these 3 had joined the post. He understood their perspective, even sympathized with it to some degree. They had fought hard wars in difficult places, and they deserved respect for their service. But their assumption that experience began and ended with their generation stung in a way he hadn't expected. He could have corrected them months ago, could have pulled out the yellowed photographs from his wallet, the commendation letters, the newspaper clippings that his late wife had kept in a scrapbook, could have told them about Firebase Charlie, about the morning when 5 North Vietnamese T-54 tanks had rolled through the perimeter and how he'd stopped them with an M48 Patton that was older than some of the soldiers he'd served with. But Tank Thompson had spent 50 years keeping his war stories to himself. The men who would have appreciated them were mostly dead now, and the men who were still alive had their own stories to carry. Besides, he'd learned long ago that the people who really needed to prove their worth were usually the ones who had the least to prove. You know what I heard? Marcus continued, warming to his subject. I heard some of these old guys got their nicknames from the stupidest stuff. Like Tank there probably got called that because he was slow or couldn't fit through doors or something. Not exactly the kind of battlefield legend you'd expect. The 3 men laughed, not cruelly, but with the casual dismissiveness of people who'd already made up their minds about someone's worth. Tank set down his coffee cup with the deliberate control of a man, counting to 10 before responding to provocation. He looked across the room at these young veterans, and they were young. He reminded himself, even the oldest wasn't even half his age, and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not anger exactly, more like sadness. Sadness that they felt the need to diminish other people's service to validate their own. Sadness that they couldn't see past the gray hair and the quiet demeanor to recognize a fellow warrior. Sadness that the Brotherhood of Arms had somehow become a competition about who had suffered more. He was about to finish his meal and leave, as he did every Friday night, when the conversation at their table took a more pointed turn. Seriously, though, Jake said, his voice carrying clearly across the room, don't you think it's kind of insulting when these old guys try to act like they understand what we went through? I mean, Tank seems like a nice enough guy, but what's he going to tell me about armor tactics or tank warfare? He probably never even saw a tank up close, let alone fought against one. Tank's hand tightened slightly around his coffee cup. Of all the assumptions they could have made, that one cut deepest. Because tank warfare wasn't just something he'd experienced. It was something he'd mastered. Something he'd lived and breathed for 3 years in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Something that had earned him a reputation among both American and enemy forces as one of the most effective tank commanders of the Vietnam War. But he said nothing, just finished his coffee, left his usual $5 tip, and prepared to walk past their table on his way to the door. That's when Tony decided to be friendly. Hey, Tank, he called out as the older man approached. How's it going, buddy? Tank paused, nodding politely. Evening, gentlemen. Good to see you. You know, Tony continued, emboldened by beer and the presence of his friends. We were just talking about different kinds of military service. Marcus here was a tank crew member in Afghanistan. Really interesting stuff about modern armor tactics. Tank's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Is that right? Marcus straightened slightly, pleased to be recognized as the expert. Yeah, I was a gunner on an M1A2 Abrams. 3 deployments, multiple combat engagements. Pretty different from the old days, I imagine. The technology now is just incredible. Thermal imaging, computer-assisted targeting, reactive armor. Nothing like what you guys had to work with back then. Different times, Tank agreed quietly. Jake leaned forward, his tone friendly but condescending. I bet you've got some stories though, right? What did you do over there? Supply? Transportation? Those guys were the backbone of the whole operation. Tank looked at these 3 young men, all of them genuinely accomplished veterans, all of them completely certain they understood his place in military history. He could have walked away, should have walked away, but something in their casual assumption that he'd never been in real combat, never faced real danger, never proven himself under fire, finally pushed him past his usual restraint. Actually, Tank said, his voice still quiet but carrying a different quality now, I was a tank commander. The 3 men exchanged glances. Not dismissive, exactly, but not particularly impressed either. Cool, Tony said. What kind of tank? M60. M48 Patton, Tank replied. Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 69th Armor Regiment. Marcus nodded knowledgeably. Right. The Patton was a decent tank for its time. Pretty basic compared to modern systems, but solid enough for the kind of limited engagements you guys had. Mostly infantry support, right? Not much tank-on-tank combat in Vietnam. Tank was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was even softer than before. 12, he said. 12 what? Jake asked. 12 enemy tanks destroyed. Confirmed kills. 3 years of combat operations, 1968 to 1971. The conversation at the table died instantly. Around them, the usual Friday night noise of the VFW continued, but at their small corner, complete silence had fallen. Marcus was the first to recover. I'm sorry, what did you say? 12 confirmed tank kills. Tank repeated matter-of-factly. 5 T-54s, 4 T-55s, 2 PT-76s, and 1 T-34 that the NVA was still using for some reason, plus about 30 other armored vehicles and personnel carriers. Tony's beer was halfway to his mouth, frozen there as he processed what he'd just heard. You're telling us, Jake said slowly, that you personally destroyed 12 enemy tanks in Vietnam? Yes, but Marcus struggled with the implications. Tank-on-tank combat was supposed to be rare in Vietnam. Most of the armor was used for infantry support and base defense. Tank nodded. It was rare, but when it happened fast and it happened hard. The NVA started bringing tanks down the Ho Chi Minh Trail in '68, especially during Tet and afterward. They'd use them for major assaults on fire bases and strategic positions. Someone had to stop them. He pulled out his wallet, a worn leather thing that looked like it had seen better decades, and removed a small, yellowed photograph. He placed it gently on the table. The photo showed a much younger version of Tank, standing beside an M48 Patton tank. He was grinning broadly, his arm around another soldier, both of them covered in mud and looking like they'd just been through hell. But what caught the 3 younger veterans' attention was what was painted on the side of the tank. 12 small silhouettes of enemy tanks, each representing a confirmed kill. Jesus Christ, Tony whispered. Tank pointed to the markings. We called her Mama's Revenge after my gunner's mother, who used to send us cookies. She was a good tank, kept us alive when a lot of other crews didn't make it home. Marcus picked up the photo with hands that weren't quite steady. This is real. Real as anything else in my wallet, Tank said simply. Jake was staring at the older man, like he was seeing him for the first time. Tank, your nickname. It wasn't because you were slow or big or anything like that. No, Tank said. It was because I killed tanks. A lot of them. The 3 young veterans sat in stunned silence, each of them processing the fact that they'd just spent months patronizing one of the most successful tank commanders in modern American military history. Sir, Marcus said, his voice now carrying a respect that hadn't been there minutes before. I owe you an apology. We all do. I had no idea. Tank held up a hand. You don't owe me anything. You serve your country with honor, same as I did. Same as everyone in this room. But we acted like... Tony started. You acted like young veterans who are proud of their service and maybe a little protective of their experiences, Tank finished. Nothing wrong with that. I was the same way when I was your age. Jake was still processing. 12 tanks. In 3 years. That's almost unheard of. Tank shrugged. It was a different war. Different kind of fighting. Your wars were just as dangerous. Just as important. Maybe more so. No, Marcus said firmly. No, sir. What you did, tank-on-tank combat, that's... He looked at his friends for support. That's legendary stuff. Before Tank could respond, a voice from across the room cut through the ambient noise of the fish fry. Well, I'll be damned. Is that Earl Tank Thompson? Everyone turned to see Colonel Harrison, the post's former commander and a man who commanded universal respect among the membership. He was walking toward their table with a grin that lit up his entire face. Colonel, Tank said, standing immediately and extending his hand. Good to see you, sir. Harrison ignored the handshake and wrapped Tank in a bear hug that lifted the smaller man off his feet. Tank Thompson, boys, do you know who you're sitting with? The 3 younger veterans looked at each other. We're just finding out, sir, Jake said. Harrison turned to address the entire room, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to meet a genuine American hero, Earl Tank Thompson, the most decorated tank commander of the Vietnam War. This man single-handedly changed the course of at least 3 major engagements, save countless American lives, and earn a reputation that made the North Vietnamese put a bounty on his head. The entire VFW had gone quiet now. Even the bartender had stopped washing glasses. Tank here, Harrison continued, was recommended for the Medal of Honor twice. Received the Distinguished Service Cross, 3 silver stars, and more Purple Hearts than he likes to talk about. And for the past 8 years, he's been sitting in that corner, listening to all of us tell our war stories, never once mentioning that his stories would make ours sound like training exercises. Tank looked distinctly uncomfortable with the attention. "Colonel, that's enough." "No, it's not enough," Harrison said, "because this man represents everything that's right about military service. Humility, dedication, and the understanding that true heroes don't need to announce themselves." He turned back to Jake, Marcus, and Tony. "You boys want to know about tank warfare? About what it means to face death every day for 3 years. About what it takes to be a real warrior. You're looking at the textbook." Marcus stood up, came to attention, and saluted. "Sir, Sergeant Marcus Johnson, United States Marine Corps. It's an honor to meet you." Tank returned the salute with the easy grace of someone who'd done it thousands of times. "At ease, Marine. And thank you." Jake and Tony followed suit, both looking somewhat shell-shocked by the revelation. "Sir," Tony said, "we owe you a huge apology. We said some things." Tank waved him off. "You said what young veterans say. Nothing I didn't say about the Korea vets when I was your age. Nothing the Korea vets didn't say about the World War II guys before them. It's the way of things. But we should have known better," Jake insisted. "We should have asked, should have shown more respect." "Son," Tank said, settling back into his chair, "respect isn't something you're born knowing how to give. It's something you learn. And the fact that you're concerned about it now tells me you're learning just fine." Colonel Harrison pulled up a chair. "Tank, these boys have been arguing for months about whether the older generation understands modern warfare. Maybe you could share some perspective?" Tank looked at the 3 younger veterans, all of whom were now hanging on his every word. "Modern warfare, old warfare," he said slowly. "The technology changes, the tactics evolve, but the fundamentals stay the same. You've got to take care of your people. You've got to complete the mission. And you've got to come home with your honor intact." He paused, looking at each of them in turn. "You boys fought in Iraq and Afghanistan. You dealt with IEDs, urban combat, counterinsurgency operations. That's hard, dangerous work that required skills I never had to develop. But you know what? The fear is the same. The responsibility for the lives of your fellow soldiers is the same. The weight of making life-or-death decisions is the same." Marcus leaned forward. "Sir, can I ask you about Firebase Charlie? I read about it in some military history, but the details were classified." Tank was quiet for a long moment. "What do you want to know?" "The reports said 5 enemy tanks broke through the perimeter and you stopped all of them single-handedly. Is that true?" Tank nodded slowly. "February 12th, 1969. Pre-dawn assault. They came through the wire with sappers and infantry, then brought up armor to finish the job. My tank was the only one in position to respond." 5 tanks, Tony said. How do you process that in the moment?" "Same way you process an IED going off next to your convoy," Tank replied. "You do your job. You trust your training. You take care of your crew and complete the mission." Jake was shaking his head in amazement. "Sir, with all due respect, that's not the same thing. 5 enemy tanks, and what you need to do in the next 30 seconds to keep everyone alive." He took a sip of his coffee, which had long since gone cold. "At Firebase Charlie, I had a good crew, a reliable tank, and clear fields of fire. The enemy made tactical mistakes. They came at us one at a time instead of coordinating their assault. We had the advantage of prepared positions and knowledge of the terrain. In the end, it wasn't about being a hero. It was about being in the right place with the right training and doing what needed to be done." "But the bounty," Harrison added. "Tell them about the bounty the NVA put on your head." Tank looked uncomfortable. "That's not really—" "The North Vietnamese put a 50,000 dong bounty on tanks specifically," Harrison explained to the younger veterans. "Dead or alive. He was that effective against their armor operations." "How did you find out about the bounty?" Marcus asked. Tank smiled slightly. the first real smile anyone had seen from him all evening. Captured NVA tank commander told us during interrogation. Said his orders were to eliminate the American tank crew that was destroying too many glorious people's vehicles. He seemed genuinely impressed when he found out he'd been captured by the guy he was supposed to kill. The conversation continued for another hour, with Tank reluctantly sharing stories that range from tactical innovations to the lighter moments that had kept his crew sane during 3 years of constant combat. The three younger veterans listened with the attention of students, asking technical questions about armor tactics, crew coordination, and the psychological challenges of tank warfare. As the evening wound down and the VFW began to empty out, Jake stood up and extended his hand to Tank. "Sir, I want to apologize again for our assumptions, and I want to thank you for sharing your experiences with us. We learned more about leadership and combat effectiveness tonight than we did in months of talking among ourselves." Tank shook his hand firmly. "Nothing to apologize for, son, but I hope you learned something else too." "What's that, sir?" "Every veteran in this room has a story. Some of them might surprise you. The guy who ran supply convoys might have been in more firefights than the infantry. The communications specialist might have coordinated operations that saved hundreds of lives. The mechanic might have kept vehicles running under impossible conditions." He gestured around the nearly empty VFW hall. "Don't assume you know someone's story based on their age, their appearance, or how much they talk about their service. Some of the quietest people in here have lived the loudest lives." Marcus nodded soberly. "Yes, sir. We'll remember that." As they prepared to leave, Tony had one final question. "Sir, why didn't you ever tell us? I mean, why sit there and listen to us talk about tank warfare when you're you?" Tank considered the question carefully. "Because, son, the best way to honor your service isn't to talk about it. It's to live it. Every day. And how you treat people, how you carry yourself, how you serve your community. The stories are just stories. The character you build from the experience, that's what really matters." He stood up, put on his jacket, and picked up the photograph from the table. "Besides," he added with a slight grin, "you boys needed to figure out for yourselves. If I just told you who I was, you might have respected the reputation. This way, maybe you learn to respect the person." As Tank walked toward the door, Colonel Harrison called out after him, "Tank, same time next Friday." Tank turned back with a smile. "Wouldn't miss it, Colonel. These boys owe me a beer." Jake, Marcus, and Tony watched him go, each of them processing the evening's revelations in their own way. "You know what the craziest part is?" Marcus said finally. "What?" Tony asked. "He's right. We spent months trying to prove we were tough, and he spent months proving he was humble. Guess which one of us learned something tonight?" The following Friday, when Tank Thompson took his usual seat in the corner of the VFW, he wasn't sitting alone. Jake, Marcus, and Tony had claimed the table next to his, and their conversation had shifted from proving their own toughness to learning from the experiences of the older veterans around them. And when new members joined the post, young veterans fresh from Iraq, Afghanistan, or wherever America's wars would take them next, Tank would listen to their stories with the same patient attention he'd always shown. But now, when they made assumptions about the older generation, one of his three new friends would always speak up. "Let me tell you about a guy we know," they'd say. "Goes by Tank. You might want to hear his story before you decide what old veterans know about warfare. Because sometimes the most important lessons aren't taught in classrooms or training manuals. Sometimes they're learned on Friday nights over fish and beer, when assumptions meet reality and pride gives way to respect. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get to learn those lessons from a legend who never needed to prove he was one."